joined together as a collaboration of the Barbican Theatre and Take a Part and Plymouth Culture, really sort of driven by Kim in the first instance, looking at the possibility of us sharing resources and bringing voices and individuals and organisations into Plymouth so that we can have an opportunity to explore different thematics, but in a way that's both affordable and kind of gives us a chance to progress a conversation locally, but with wider national and international input. So we're starting this as the first one. It was something we had planned with Tom over the last few months, actually, and because of the COVID situation, I went back to Tom to say, we very much want to make this happen. If anything, it's more important than ever, but could we do it in this format, and could we make sure that the topic is around the relevance that we're facing now? So I think it's fair to say, Kim and Laura, this is very much an experiment as the first one. We would like it to become a series throughout the year. And we've sort of pitched it through invitation at organisations that are very much either in a development phase or a transition phase, so that this isn't specifically around new startup or emerging. It's very much those organisations that we feel would benefit from this type of discussion, this type of kind of developmental work. So we're really keen not just to hear your feedback on the particular topic today, but the whole process and the concept of kind of taking this forward and what you might want to see as a series of talks or workshops or presentations evolving. So we're really grateful to have Tom here, and we hope that you find this very useful, but please do be really honest in terms of where we might be able to take it next.
Great, thank you very much, Hannah, and thanks to Kim and Laura as well. It's nice to be with you today. I'm going to speak for between half an hour and 40 minutes and just go through a few themes that are relevant in particular to these interesting times that we face now. We're then going to move on to a Q&A session where we can have a wide discussion around some of these topics. And if there's anything in particular I haven't covered, then feel free to raise that later. And thanks for your questions in advance as well. So, there we go. So these are the particular themes and things I'm going to try and pick up. How can we build resilience and sustainability now, given the current situation? What steps should we be taking in terms of our operations and reporting, our advocacy and our team to create the best offer? How can we sustain income when ticket sales, other commercial income and fundraising are lapsing? What can we do to do things better? And how can we govern ourselves to support change? So the way I'm going to approach this is to talk through essentially a top 10 list of ways to approach it. So this pandemic is really a test of leadership, and organisations with strong governance, management systems and procedures, as well as those that embrace creativity and innovation, or you could say especially those that embrace creativity and innovation, are the most likely to survive and to thrive from this. A positive approach would be to embrace the limitations of the situation and use this opportunity to make your name and make your organisation's name as we slowly come out of this current situation. So never more apposite than now. This Shakespeare quote: "Sweet are the uses of adversity, which, like the toad, ugly and venomous, wears yet a precious jewel in his head." Okay, so first of all, I'm going to talk about dealing with the immediate crisis, and I'm going to move on to talking about planning for afterwards. So first, I think the first thing to say is never waste a good crisis. So this is, for many of us, an opportunity to make positive changes to your organisation. So, you know, if you've existed for some time, it might apply more particularly where you've got activities that you've been doing for a long period of time, or ways of working that aren't working particularly well. You might have costly activities or things that are kind of off brand. And this is an opportunity to address them and to change them, perhaps in a way that in normal times it's much more unthinkable to do so. So in many ways also it's about making a virtue of adversity. So I was working with a festival last year, and they had, long before these problems, they had severe financial difficulties. And one of the approaches to coming out of those difficulties was to find an artistic aesthetic that was acceptable to them, that almost made a virtue of not having any money. So is there a way within the palette of things that you want to do as artists and curators and directors that means that you can deliver work unashamedly more cheaply, but that meets all the artistic criteria you have, but is using less resources? It's not always easy for everyone to do that, but there are some cases that you can. So, in this particular case, it meant having a series of productions that were one or two handers rather than with a group of actors, and trying to make a virtue of that particular fact. Second one, form a wall cabinet, if you like, an emergency working group based around senior management. Of course, this depends on the size of your organisation, but a selection of colleagues from across organisations where appropriate. Try to create a consensus around what you're doing, but I would say don't fear disagreement, as some people will always fight for their own agendas, even in the face of existential threats. So checking this a slightly more prosaic point here, check existing insurance policies if you haven't already around loss of income clauses. Many of our clients, where they have loss of income clauses, are battling with their insurers at the moment about actually claiming them. And I'd be interested if there are any examples from your organisations here about that. It's one thing to say check them, and quite another thing to actually receive the money, but we'll perhaps come back to that later. And also perhaps to create a list of assets that could be quickly converted into cash if possible. So what do you own that you could convert into cash if you absolutely had to? Be decisive. It may be necessary for many organisations and artists to make hard or even ruthless decisions to survive. It sounds unnaturally Darwinian talking in these terms, and it's definitely uncomfortable, but we are in exceptional circumstances. But no one will thank you for bankrupting an organisation later by avoiding difficult choices now. And let me give an example of that. And I'm not offering an opinion about this or to say what's right in every circumstance, but there are arts organisations who have furloughed people where they're topping up with 20% for the furloughing to 100%, and that's a perfectly legitimate choice for anyone to make. But within those that have done that, there are some that will come to regret that later when they don't have enough cash later. So again, I'm not saying what anyone should do about it, but that's a really good example of a very, very difficult choice that you have to make between the moral imperative of wanting to pay people their full pay where they're furloughed and the organisation's survival. Also, as well, the other dilemma of that one is that everyone who's working extra hard for 100% of their salary, there's the equity between them and the people who are not working who are also being paid 100% of the salary. So there's a lot to consider around that issue. I'm sure many of you know people who are furloughed at present. And a rare foray for Joni Mitchell into management theory, that we're just trying to get ourselves back into the garden, So some of the difficult things that we have to do along the way are necessary. Make necessary cuts quickly. So in my career, I've found myself in situations with organisations about to go bust, and there's definitely one thing I've learned is the earlier and deeper you can make cuts, the more benefit you have later on. So deferring those difficult decisions doesn't always help in these situations. So if you know that something needs to go and something needs to change, do it as early as possible, and you'll have more money to play with to make things happen later. And in that, don't let vested interest within the organisation stop you from doing what's necessary to ensure that it doesn't disappear. I think Mr. McCorber in Dickens has the last word on financial sustainability. I'm not going to read that out. Okay. Moving on, cash is king. Prepare detailed weekly or daily cash flow forecasts. Now, there's a problem really with this next point around paying suppliers, because sometimes in really extreme financial circumstances, surviving as an organisation relies on you not paying people as promptly as you would like to do normally. Okay, so that in itself presents a dilemma when many of your suppliers will be artists and other creative people, individual freelancers. So I think we just have to recognise that it's a dilemma. Every good arts organisation or project pays its artists and everyone else on time when they can, but there may be difficult choices around when you're paying people, and I found in my own experience that if you absolutely can't pay people because you're essentially insolvent, you have cash flow problems, then talking to them about it and explaining and telling them when you will pay them, or agreeing that you'll pay some now and some later, and communicating is absolutely key to managing your reputation around that. If it's a big corporation, of course, you can, you're a bit more at liberty to not pay them promptly. Although ironically, they're often better at following that up. But just one thing that I've done in the past is stop paying most suppliers digitally, and to move back to paying checks, because by the time your suppliers, I'm not talking about individual artists either or freelancers, I'm talking about big companies. By the time they've cashed the check, if you are able to still pay them by check, you've probably got 2 weeks extra cash flow from that payment. So it's just something to think about during this particular circumstances. Communicate clearly and regularly with all stakeholders. So create a compelling narrative about what you're doing at the moment. Why you're doing the programs or activities you are, and why you're not doing others. Why you're furloughing some staff and not others. Why, what's the rationale? Why are you doing some things that you've decided to do? Because it won't always be clear to people. It might be clear why that you've shut your building, but might not be clear why you're continuing with one outreach program, community program, and not with another, for example. And I think show empathy for anyone affected by your decisions in your corporate communications, and emphasise the overarching imperative that the company continues to exist. And that is the most important thing. But again, with good communication, people will come along with you much more on that. I'm sure these are all things most of you are doing, by the way, and we'll come on to talk much more about future things shortly. And I think safety first. Now, I just want to mention this because there will inevitably be a time where there is massive ambiguity about what restrictions will be lifted and when they'll be lifted, and with the likelihood that large gatherings of people, i.e. performing arts and other arts activity, will be one of the last things to come out of this. So when there is some discretion about what you do, I think just to be seen to be taking extra care around safety is a really good thing. So even beyond what the restrictions will be subsequently, just to be seen to as an arts organisation or project, or as an artist, to be taking extra care around it, I think will become incredibly important, because there's a gap between eventually what we'll be required to do in a statutory sense and what will be good for us to be seen to do. I'm sure many of you have done this already. Those of you that are funded by either public sector or lottery or individual donors or sponsors or trusts and foundations, I don't know if any of you, I'd like to again ask you this at the end, but whether or not they've brought forward payments to you, or agreed to change schedules or change grant conditions. I know the Arts Council's changed grant conditions, hasn't it, for example, in this period, so you can get cash sooner without necessarily delivering all the same outputs and reporting that you would normally have to do. But a number of our clients have got trusts and foundations and even individual donors to make payments early to them. Be aware of all government initiatives. It's very hard to keep up, even for people like me whose job it is to know what they all are. And there's something different announced every day, or some variation every day. Personally, what I do, I just pick a couple of sites where these things are disseminated, and the two I've put on the slide here. We'll send the slides to everyone afterwards. But the lawyers, Bates Wells, have a section where they have all the legal updates related to COVID-19, and Moore Kingston Smith, the accountants, have all the there's some crossover between them, but all the other statutory information and financial information around that. So just to keep on sort of making sure that you're having the benefit of everything that the government is putting out, because there are so many different initiatives and schemes. What would have been better is a taxable universal payment to everyone, but never mind, we're way past that. It's much too simple for the brilliant minds of the Treasury, that one. So why do that when you can do 1,000 little things that create 500 exceptions and gaps that people fall between? That's clearly much better. But it's the value of having done PPE at Oxford, wrong kind of PPE. So more on that in a bit. And I think that the big idea really, and this goes to the first thing I talked about in these 10 points, is this idea of abandon yesterday. Okay, so if you were starting whatever practice or organisation you're in now, if you were starting it again, how would you do it? How would it be different from the one that you have historically? And if there's ever a time to drop the things you didn't do very well or change them or to make fundamental changes, this surely must be the time, absolutely, to do that and to abandon the past. So, you know, what can be jettisoned or changed? How can you be creative and find innovative ways of reducing financial exposure? Look at the range of activities and what income expenditures for each. And also, what do you charge for and how much? You know, are there things you've been doing for free for years that aren't really covered by any of your funding and you're in the habit of doing them? How can that be improved to make your business model more resilient? So if you don't mind, because I think he's an interesting thinker and his time has definitely come. I'm just going to talk a bit more about Drucker and this idea about abandoning yesterday, because I think it's we've never had experienced something like this in our lives. So he says the first policy and the foundation for all others is to abandon yesterday. The first need is to free resources from being committed to maintaining what no longer contributes to performance and no longer produces results. In fact, it's not possible to create tomorrow unless one first sloughs off yesterday. To maintain yesterday is always extremely difficult and time consuming. To maintain yesterday always commits the institution's scarcest and most valuable resources, and above all, its ablest people to non-results. Yet to do anything different, let alone to innovate, always runs into unexpected difficulties. It therefore always demands leadership by people of high and proven ability. If these people are committed to maintaining yesterday, they are simply not available to create tomorrow. The first change policy, therefore, throughout the entire institution has to be organised abandonment. Now, that's him writing in the late 90s. It's all very well, I guess, advocating that when the whole system of public funding, in many ways, is very much weighted towards maintaining the status quo, isn't it, of institutions and buildings, and so it's quite a challenge to try and subvert that and think of something new. So just to continue with Drucker a bit, so he argues that abandonment is called for in all of these cases, and he says it's the right action if a product, service, market, or process still has a few good years left of life. In other words, if something's still valid and it works, but it's coming to the end of its life, it's okay to end it early, recognizing that. Okay, you don't have to, but it's okay to. Abandonment is the right action if the only argument for keeping a product, service, market, or process is that it's already paid for. Hey, we've got an art, we've got an opera house, so we've paid for it now, so we've got to use it. Actually, you don't. He's saying sunk costs are irrelevant if you don't want two opera houses within 500 yards of each other in the central London. Don't have them. It doesn't matter that you've got them there already. It's irrelevant. And 3, abandonment is the right action if the maintenance of the old and declining product, service, market, or process is causing a new and growing product, service, market, or process to be starved, stunted, or neglected. So, is what you're maintaining stopping you from doing something better? And we've literally never had a full stop like this where we can consider this properly. So a lot of my career, I worked for 7 years at Whitechapel Gallery, which had been going for over 100 years before I joined it. And organisations of that size and age accrue an awful lot of practices and ways of working over a period of time. It's like the bottom of a boat. There's all sorts of stuff stuck to it, and it's very hard to get that off. Okay, moving on to talk about post this period now. I would just draw your attention. This is on our website. So we've developed a very simple tool, which is really useful for planning workshops and teams planning what's going to happen next. And this is just a few notes from my colleague Stephen, which I'll send you. I won't read them out to you, but I'll just very briefly show you the tool, if I may, here. And I'll send it to you in Word in the original document as well, not a PDF, if you wish to amend it and use it if it's helpful. Can everyone see that all right, more or less? Yeah, I mean, enough for me just to talk through it now. Okay, that's great. So we've got various scenarios on the left, and of course you can change these as you see fit. So one is a return to something like normality, but with social distancing. One is a return with temporary post-COVID implications. So the first one really might be the shorter term implication, second one the medium term, and the third one more the longer term. The third one is the new normal or the next normal. What is that? And what it's done, segmented into audiences, financial, artistic program, partnerships, organizational. Again, you can play around with this all you like. So first of all, in each of these scenarios, what changes? You know, what the positive changes, what the negative changes. What are the necessary or possible responses? So how do you respond to these things, positively or negatively? Positively, you might be able to do more of one kind of programming. You know, you might be able to have more of your content online. That's a bit of a cliche. It's hard not to say that at the moment. But anyway, that's one. The negative consequences might be that you need a significant restructure and you have fewer colleagues, for example. So you've listed those there. And then the longer term strategic impact, what's positive and negative. And then finally, just thoughts on the timescale. So there are a few interesting things. You know, when, for example, performing arts can start really going back to business in earnest. You know, if ever. I don't want to say that, but I mean, when that can really happen. And of course, tying that up with the next MPO round for those of you that are Arts Council MPO funded, which I know many of you are. Anyway, we've just found this a useful thing to do around an away day or strategic session, and I'm sure this chimes with a lot of the thinking that you've been doing yourselves. Great. Moving on, I just also want to just point out this article by my colleague Andrea Nixon, and really she taught. This is also on our website, and I'll send you the link to that. But we've been expecting really in my firm much more pressure for organisations to consolidate, you know, to merge, to form more partnerships, to share more costs for years. You know, I've been expecting that for 10 years really to happen, and it hasn't happened anything like as much as I thought it would. And the reason it hasn't happened as much is because ultimately it's a pain and it's very annoying to do, and it's seeds control and it's fiddly, and organisations don't want to do it unless they absolutely have to economically. And the other reason why not as well is that the financial benefits and operational benefits of working more closely with other organisations, or in fact merging them, aren't always realised by those kind of mergers. But I do think we're going to enter a period now where many more collaborations are necessary just to keep the infrastructure going, such things. So, you know, I mean, for example, I'm originally from Colchester, and there are 5 MPOs within a mile, you know, in a square mile, and this is quite not a massive place, and they duplicate everything. You know, there's different box office systems, there's different finance departments. You know, there must be, if not merging them, that's quite a radical option, and that has other implications for them. But there must be ways of saving money and making it more efficient, and actually a better experience for audiences from them working together more closely. And there must be an economic premium in that that's worth exploring now. And in fact, you know, do they all need a building? You know, not. I mean, maybe they do, but I mean, it's a question that if you really are abandoning yesterday, you want to ask those questions. Anyway, I'll let you read that article at your leisure if you wish. So I think some of these considerations coalesce around a few themes, and these chime with a lot of the questions that you kindly sent me in advance. So I think when we start talking shortly, we can get into these themes. I think digital is you know, it's clearly a theme. A lot of people talking about digital content. I must say, I mean, I think the other thing that's really clear from this time is how much the actual real visceral experience of engaging with art live, it can never be replaced. You know, I absolutely think that, and I think it's good to be able to access more content digitally. You know, I mean, people enjoying NT Live, all the other things, many other things, is great. But it has also reinforced the value, I think, of real face-to-face art, and the communal experience of sharing the consumption of art together as well is the other thing that a digital platform can never quite never quite do in the same way. Even if you're in a cinema, if I'm in a cinema in Liverpool near where I live with 300 other people and we're all watching Swan Lake, we are sharing an experience in a way, but it's still not quite the same as seeing the real thing. But I think the other part of digital is that in the arts, because of lack of investment, and also, frankly, because we as an industry haven't prioritised it enough, our digital infrastructure isn't nearly good enough, And I think the way that we market and sell tickets and the way we understand consumer behaviour and the role of digital in that has got to become more of a priority, I think, subsequently. But we'll see. I've already talked about aggregations, mergers, partnerships, and collaborations. I think that absolutely will be a theme. More personal aspects to an offer. Okay, so someone in their own space watching Netflix has everything how they want it, don't they? They watch these days. You can watch what you want when you want to watch it, and you can control your environment in a different way. And I think that might reflect in the way that arts is presented more. So, I mean, for example, some festivals, you pay a bit more and you have a premium experience. You only queue an hour at the bar rather than 3. So that's. But there are other ways of making offers more personal, and I think they will be explored. Infrastructure. Do we have too many buildings? Is too much of the nation's funding of arts on maintaining the estate? I can't see many new things being built that aren't already in train now for years. But will there be more consolidation, more organisations in fewer buildings? Will there be more art in public spaces, in spaces that aren't set up for artwork? I mean, that's already a trend that's been going on for some time, as many of these are actually. And transport issues, of course, around infrastructure, and will they still go ahead? I expect they will, but with HS2, but all the other regional development that was mooted before this happened around the election, to what extent will they still invest in that? And that's a massive consideration for the arts. I think the fifth theme, and there are probably more, is the community local aspect. So will people start to buy more locally? Some aspects of the whole idea of around globalism, of it's all right just to fly anything from anywhere, anytime, I think is much more under question than it's been previously to that. Will there be travel constraints? Will it be more will there be fewer airlines? I've worked in visual arts a lot in my life, and there's a group of people and objects that spend all the time literally going around the world, and a lot of the top end of the market for that is based on those people traveling everywhere, and it's a slightly grotesque side of it, and it's unsustainable. So what effect will this have on it? But cutting across all of these themes is uncertainty about how art will be made and disseminated, and the formula and the blend of individual artists and cultural institutions and global tech giants, all your social media providers and everything else, and broadcasters, and the government-private formula as well. I think the whole formula is up in the air, so it's up for debate. Right, that's probably enough of my monologue, I would have thought, at this point. I'd love to hear some questions and some discussion around those things. So if I hand over, I think Kim is going to compare this part of the discussion.
Thanks, Tom. That was really interesting and thought-provoking, and also a bit reassuring, I know, for myself, to hear it's okay to do these things, and doing these acts really rapidly is actually healthy. I've thought that I was doing things very fleet of foot and kind of in a slapdash way, but it gave me confidence to hear you talking in that way about the decisions, so thank you. I just wanted to open it up to anybody who wanted to propose a question. We can do it 2 ways. You can use the chat box on the side if you want to type something that I can propose, or if you want to do a show of hands and we can unmute ourselves to have a bit of a discussion. Let me get to gallery view so I can see all of you. Great. Does anyone have anything they want to put forward? No. Okay. maybe some of the things that you were talking about in the discussion.
Kim, I think Donna might have had
Oh, great, Donna. Excellent.
Yeah, so it's not a question, it's just going back to something that Tom mentioned about funding. So where we sit at the moment, we've got capital development going forward. So either the funders are contacting us, or if they haven't, I've then gone back to funders to establish what it means to where we are now. I think the response I've had has been really positive. So it's more about them being clear about where we move forward with the funding, with the project, what that means on timescale. So what it hasn't done, there's been no funding been withdrawn or anything. It's all been just be really clear about how it's moving forward and any changes. What I have found with funding though, outside of that, is lots of foundations and lots of funding streams are just like not moving forward at the moment. So where I'd just wrote an application to the Charitable Trust Foundation, that they won't be even looking at any funding now until summer or autumn. So what it means for us is we really need to think about what Tom was mentioning earlier about, it's not just about where this sits now and the effect, but the medium to long term, and what does that mean in how we respond to it. But I think most funders are really trying to honour it, their funding that they've given. They just need clarity on what that means to the project. So that's all I was going to add at that point.
Great, thank you. Does anyone else have something to add or to counter? Okay. Oh, Fiona.
Hi, can you hear me, Tom? Thanks, that was a really nice presentation. It was really good to hear. Conscious Sisters are doing quite a lot of digital stuff, which for my sister actually is a little bit of a stretch, although she's doing a really good job. There's quite a lot of sniffiness around like people doing digital content, and I find it slightly irritating, although I really love doing face-to-face work, and I think socially engaged practice is amazing in a face-to-face context. Why is this sniffiness about digital skills? Because for me, I know we're kind of acclimatized to it, and it is a bit of a drag as well, but also it's like this super opportunity for artists and people to get like really great digital savvy skills now that they can then use in a mixed economy later on. I don't know how you feel about that, Tom.
Well, I agree with you, Fiona, that it's very important, and you know what else is there to do? You know, if you can't do it face to face, you have to do it. But I think it's just the ubiquity with which we all mention it. You know, I mean, I must talk about digital content 10 times a day, and I kind of die inside a little bit as I do it. But I think it's really important, and it has to be done. I mean, just a little anecdote. I've got some clients in the music industry who are making more money with their. I don't think this is sustainable, by the way. But at the moment, they're making more money by doing gigs from their bedrooms at home than they are actually going out to venues. So there is definitely a demand for it, and for something live and very bespoke and something niche that isn't the obvious thing. So I think all of those things are really important, and I do agree. It's just for every good bit of content, there's something bad that someone else has made, isn't there? And that doesn't help.
Yeah, and I think it's just it's really difficult for artists who are used to working, you know, with their hands in a face-to-face context to suddenly then have to make like these really cool, slick, like make videos and this, that, and the other. And I mean, we've certainly people have certainly given us great feedback about how they look forward to it. We've put stuff on Vimeo and stuff like that. We haven't put it out to the wider world, only within our own groups at the moment, because we don't feel like polished enough. But actually, isn't it really comforting now that it's the opposite of being polished that's kind of polished now?
Well, that's brilliant. I think there's an opportunity to learn skills and to get a look at that. It's incredibly useful, and it will serve everyone well.
Thanks, Tom.
Laura had a comment.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think the real skill is to start to understand for yourselves and your companies, so not as a generalization, the difference between marketing and distribution, and how tools that are based on recorded assets allow you to reach different people, which is kind of actually what Helen's saying about, you know, work that wouldn't previously tour down into Devon and how it reaches you, or how that means we can see archive footage that people have been holding very closely, which they're now suddenly releasing. But that is not actually the widest breadth of the most extraordinary work that's been happening, which is fusing, which is tangible and physical and digital and real, and where there are practitioners who've been telling extraordinary stories with embedded tech or using just those as extra tools in their tool belt. And I think we're in a place still at the moment where there's just a lot of noise, and those who had very high quality assets have made a lot of noise with their assets. But that is very different from the real makers who had already been embedding this in their craft. And how do we start to hear from those voices and understand their expertise, which they've had for 10, 20, 30 years, and allow them to help inform us? And I think it's really worth looking for examples within your art forms or your organization's passions that help you see how they can work as extra tools for you, rather than just suddenly feeling like we have to distribute stuff. I also think that there is actually I think the National Theatre and some of the others actually need to be being better in their distribution models at the moment. So the production of Frankenstein, which the National Theatre put out last week, is a pre-recorded production which they have had and they own. They didn't bother doing audio description for the live stream or for the YouTube content. And they said they didn't have the resources. And it's like, you already had the video, you already had the script, you had this as a pre-recorded asset, and you knew you were going to release it. And in my opinion, that's unacceptable. So we have to also be thinking about actually what the accessibility, but also not just being slapdash in our understanding with that. Personally, I'm going to shut up now. Bye.
I mean, also though is a huge swathe of the population that doesn't have access to digital. There may be one household that has one smartphone, but between 5 or 6 people. And so I think what you were saying about having that mix of approaches is the right way forward. So people can dip in at the places that best suit them and they're most comfortable with. It does feel like it's been thrown down our throats that I know the non MPO emergency fund was about digital output, and I think it's not a panacea, and we need to be really careful about.
Oh, I agree, Kim. Sorry, Hannah. Just before we come to you, just one point. I mean, there's a distinction between content that's made to be put out through digital distribution and work that you're making anyway that you then make available digitally. And the latter is always interesting because I mean something unimaginable for people of my age, you know, our age, unless you're very young. Where I used to work at Siobhan Davis Dance Company, and the idea of being able to go online and watch every production that they'd ever made was impossible. You know, when I was working there, you know. But now something like that is very real. But there's, you know. Because with that, of course, you just get a second bite with audiences, and it's an advocacy tool and it's a marketing tool and it's all of those things, as opposed to making content that's specifically for that. Sorry, I just wanted to add that point.
Hannah?
I was just thinking about the kind of blended element of it, and I think that's like you said, Fiona, I think potentially the sniffiness is where people haven't ever done it before because they haven't seen it as part of their business model or part of their audience's need, and then all of a sudden apparently it's the solution. But if it wasn't before, why is it now? And so I'm quite interested in, as a sector, how we would learn from, for example, the education sector, who have for a long time now moved to more of a blended learning approach. And I think, having worked in education for sort of 11 years, it was always a fear, I think, don't go digital because it will take away jobs from teachers and such and such and such. And of course it hasn't happened like that, because actually it only ever works when it's a blended model and not a replacement model. And so I think there's something quite interesting to learn from those sectors who are possibly doing it well, or at least exploring the pitfalls of it, and how it becomes very much a blended approach for the sector, not replacement.
Mm-hmm. Great. There was a question, I think it was from you, Claire, that you sent through, which was about creating value while we've been doing all of this digital stuff and giving so much away. how do we move audiences back into paying for those theater tickets? Or are we giving too much away, or actually are we creating more audience? I see, Helen, you've mentioned here that it's driving you to seek out more theater. So I don't know, have you heard any data or trends? Does anyone know or have experience of that? Or a thought on it?
I'm sorry, I don't have any answers, but I think one of the questions I keep asking is anyone tracking what this is doing to audience? So everyone's saying, isn't it brilliant? We've got these viewers, but are they the same audience we had before, and we're just keeping them happy until they can return? Is it a new audience? I don't know whether Tom knows more about that, but I've actually struggled to find that sort of information out about what this particular period of digital overload is doing to audiences.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting conundrum. But I think the main thing that we'll have to really try and track is when people come back to watch, to engage with art directly, the relationship between those that were looking at the digital content in this period now and who comes back, and the difference between that and the original audience. Be fascinating, but not all organisations are going to be able to track that in any way at all. Some are and some aren't, and it's a lost opportunity to know that, isn't it? To know the efficacy of putting out this stuff and having an online presence and broadening your reach. But will people actually come and engage directly with you afterwards?
Yeah, Donna, you look like you were about to say something.
I think what's going on in my mind is we've just got to, if there's a possibility to track, we have to work out how we're going to track what it is we want to track now. We have to think about the information that we're looking to collate. So I think what I'm hearing a lot of at the moment is what can we capture, but actually I think particularly for things like theatres, this is very much, or cinemas, or those where there's close proximity, it's there is the issue of value, but for me there's also the issue of what this means medium and long term. So because you give something away, does that devalue it? I don't know. Look at contemporary arts. I don't know. What I would say about it is this is an opportunity to look at it and consider and think about what medium to long term looks like in the future. So we're not going to have the answers now to a lot of this stuff, but while there is the opportunity to collect the analytics, why would we not do that? But as always, because we're disjointed, we work in different ways, who's got the capacity, who's got the want, and who's got the need? Are we going to do it separately? We're going to do it collectively? These are the things we need to think about. And as a city, what do we want to collect in data? What do we want to learn? What do we want to learn as a region? I think it's all these things that are almost the questions before we start looking at the value of stuff. The value sits within all of those things. So let's think about a city and a region. What is it we're looking to learn from this? What might be useful for us? And if there is stats of any kind, why are we not collecting them holistically? It's probably what I would say.
Laura.
I'm just thinking about what Kim was asking and what Helen's written in the commentary about. Helen wrote a point about the watching live in the future will be at a point of an investment already in them, in the sense of it's like when you go to see a band after you've heard their albums or encountered them in a different way, which I think is a really valid point. But it's made me think about, Kim, as you were saying, how do you re-engage a financial value to that market, to that live experience? And actually there is a bigger, wider ramification with that, which Tom, you hinted on, but which I've been talking about with some of the music lawyers and my friends over in the States, which is really fascinating, which is that visas for artists are time limited. If the tour's not happened, you can't shift the time window for those visas. So actually there's going to be an added ramification, which is like a large number of the world are not going to be able to get their visas to go on their tours, even if they totally reschedule the tours, because the visa allowance isn't going to be there, let alone actually a reticence about traveling or the economy of scale around the performances and how does that all shift. And I think we had an interesting provocation, and I'd be interested to hear what the rest of this room feel, which was around whether or not we were actually almost, in many ways, returning almost to an 18th and 19th century understanding of creativity and culture, which is that it is something embedded in almost, this is grandiose, so shoot me down happily, in any community or any household, but almost at a non-IP regulated level, so at a point when it is not becomes a formalized or owned art form. So before the point when photography was invented, in the sense of everyone gathering in a pub and whoever, like you still have in Cornwall, sharing songs, exchanging music, of if you happen to play the fiddle and somebody else happened to be able to do some drumming and add in some, and what that does is communal and owned artistry and creative voices. I don't know what that does about the market, but I am very interested in what that is over the next 18 months, 2 years, as a journey, and I'm just wondering what anyone else's thoughts are, because I think that connects into how do you find a different type of audience, or a different type of paying audience.
Yeah, I think you're right. I was thinking about the digital as well, in terms of audience and how you just present to the same echo chamber, the same group of people who are already engaging with you. And so to get a new audience requires either doing something that's hyper local and very bespoke, and developing partnerships where you can share your work across sectors of audiences that you haven't previously engaged with, because otherwise it's, we're just putting stuff out to like the 300 people on your mailing list forever and ever and getting funded for that, and that's not sustainable. So we do have to think about how audiences are re-engaged and continue to be engaged. And I'm not sure that while digital does have an element, it's not the answer for sure. Anyone else have something? I see Hannah has noted about Patreon. Is that you? Which Hannah? Yay. Do you want to talk about, because obviously you work in a very similar way to Take Part, you're really on the ground with the communities. Do you want to talk about what's happening in terms of your audiences and your ways of working?
Yeah, well, so our audience with like urgent need is obviously increasing week by week and is diversifying. So we're seeing more people that have completely lost their income needing to access support for the first time. And so that's a very different audience that haven't necessarily ever had to access help before. So there's some interesting learning that we've got around that, I think. And then how we start to mix. So we're one of the things I'm looking at, we've set up a Wi-Fi net around Union Street to create free Wi-Fi for the local community as part of kind of supporting them to get online and things. And I'm kind of exploring what's possible with that. So I know the police have used that in terms of accessing communities sort of geographically. People are engaging on that Wi-Fi. Is there a way to draw their attention to more creative content and things like that? I think there might be some interesting opportunities there, and yeah, and then sort of how we support people to get online, but to mix that in with their experience out in the street, because obviously people are going out every day, and it's kind of, I think it's interesting how little organisations are using their buildings and their windows and their walls and things like that to audience. And I think that might be symptomatic of most of us working from home and therefore not being faced with that building or that space regularly. But I know as soon as I go around the street, you're kind of instantly going, oh, we could do something better in this or on this pavement and stuff like that. So I think, and then mixing those. So we're working with Wonder Zoo to do Wonder Queue, where they can listen to, people can listen to poetry whilst they queue for the supermarket. Yeah. And so I think there's opportunities to mix the physical with the digital, I guess, that will start to play out in really lovely ways over the next few months.
Great. Great. Any other questions? Has anyone been able to claim on insurance? That was a question early on that I wrote down. Has anyone had any success? We did not. I'll take that as a no. And have people been furloughing, and how is that working, especially for small organizations that don't have a lot of capacity already, and then are stuck in this situation where their funds are depleting, so they choose to furlough? Has anyone been kind of in a rock and a hard place in that way? No, that's good news. Ellie.
Hello. So we can't furlough anybody basically. So we're in a small rock and a hard place in that we have just enough clients and work to need every single one of my team to be around, but not sufficient stuff happening at the moment to keep us all busy 5 days a week. But really, really feeling that for various reasons with all of my team, to ask them to drop their hours or to take less pay would put them into a very difficult place that would be really bad for the organisation at the moment and bad for those people. So I've dropped my salary to try and compensate for that, but I haven't asked any of my team to drop their salary because I just don't feel I want to do that yet. Taking what Tom said, I've heard what you said about sometimes you have to make really difficult decisions. It was a difficult decision, but I've spent a lot of time deciding that that's how I would best like to approach this. And it's the right decision for us at the moment, but also taking in mind that, you have to keep revisiting decisions you've made, because when the facts change, you need to maybe change as well. So it's complicated, but no, we've not been able to furlough anyone. As juicy an opportunity as that looked at first, we just keep swimming without having to paddle really, really hard. We haven't been able to do it.
And then there's this thing coming up where furloughing is going to drop to 60%. And at that point, that's like when people might just up sticks and leave. So there you've got a staff retention issue coming on the other side if you as an organization don't do a top up to the 80 or 100%. And then you can lose your talent and the expertise that you've nurtured for so long within the organization. And so many of the pieces of work that we're all doing are attached to projects. So for Take Apart, our team is with us till December. Beyond that, they're not, unless I have another project. Right now, it's not really feeling like there's going to be a huge amount of like do what you want art projects coming up. So I can see a further away from me a crisis looming that I'm trying to do what I can to plug holes in by changing the way that we work. But furloughing is not always the answer, I think, either.
No, not at all. I think what would be more helpful and may emerge at the end of this is some kind of scheme where the government pays a lower proportion but people are allowed to work, because it's the maddening extreme logic of capitalism that people are being paid not to work. There's a lot to do. So it had its purpose for a while, but I think as we come out of this, that they should be encouraged to. So we made representations to DCMS about this, that even a much lower proportion that allows you to keep people on but get them back to work is more beneficial for everyone.
Yeah, I thought it was really disappointing as well, some of the conversations around the relationship between furloughing and volunteering. We've benefited from some chefs are just sort of desperate to want to do something. We've followed 2 people, but we've linked them with organisations locally to volunteer. He's still contributing. We're in touch with them, but I think, I'm disappointed around the sort of charity and the sort of community side of things, and the potential that there was, and how we might talk to some of those people that have volunteered whilst being furloughed, and how we retain that as well. I think there could be real opportunities there for the cultural sector.
Just going back to your connecting into that conversation about furloughing, and Tom, your point about some organisations doing it at 100%. Most of the organisations I knew that chose to do it at 100% for the first month were doing it so that they could give the furloughed staff a month's notice of a reduction of wages, and then taper down to 80% from then after, with 30 days notice, so that they had a chance to at least allow the furloughing staff to have the information with as much notice as possible, so they could prepare for any reduction in their family income. But most I knew on the southwest who I've been talking to knew the figures didn't work if they tried to keep topping up, like it just, because of the extra costs. So just wanted to feed that back, because I wasn't sure if that's what you've been hearing your end as well.
Yeah, sure. And I don't have an opinion either way. Obviously, it's better to pay people what their full salary is. It's just recognising the dilemma really around that.
Any other thoughts or comments, or ways that you're coping, or strategies that you're trying right now?
Is there something? Oh, sorry, Hannah. Is there something that people are going to abandon about what you did previously, your previous practice or activities, or you know?
Hannah, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, it wasn't in response to that. I mean, so I'm here representing CAMP today, and we're a voluntary organisation, so run by volunteers, and one's very part-time member of staff. So we're used to working with very little, which might be to our benefit right now. But I think, to echo what Kim is saying, for us, it's more about the long, not the immediate. There's an immediate impact for sure, because the community that we serve are precarious workers who are losing their income. So therefore we're losing members. But the actual longer term impact in terms of access to funding, I think it's going to become more problematic. As I wrote earlier in my kind of issues that we're facing, CAMP falls between the cracks in terms of funding. Outside of Arts Council, we're finding it really difficult to access funding and trying lots of different routes. And now that funding is becoming even more difficult to access, because it's either closing, like Donna was saying, or it's being redirected. So we're noticing that lots of trusts and foundations, the focus of their funding is now changing. And so I think for us, it's looking towards the next 6 to 8 to 12 months, kind of past this immediate point. And I think Tom's point about kind of actually forming that emergency group now and planning for that now, I think, that sense of urgency around, like, when our Arts Council funding runs out, which is very small, it's a project grant, but when that finishes, planning for not having any money essentially, and that being a kind of focus for us for the next few months.
Can I ask? Oh, sorry, Hannah's going to come in.
So I guess it's slightly related to Tom's point, but it's more of a question to Tom really, is that obviously I'm doing a lot of work with the local authority in terms of restart, recovery plans and all the rest of it. And I'm very much in this space, which is, rather than look at how we save everything we had, why don't we think about what we want and then figure out what we need to save or what we need to bolster? But and I'm assuming this is a safe space, so hopefully it is. I'm finding when you're working with a lot of local authority, they don't necessarily think like that. And I think they think recovery is, let's get back on our feet as quickly as possible, as normally as possible. And I think I'm just interested to understand whether you're working with any really interesting organisations or people that don't see this kind of conversation as radical, hippie, nice to have, not economically viable, but are actually saying, actually, this is the economic and social driving force of the future, and how do we make that a viable proposition for a restart plan?
Yeah, well, I think there's a real variation in sort of a conceptual ability to really grasp how extreme these circumstances are and what can be done about it. I mean, a lot of our clients are either directly controlled by the local authority, or you know, they own the building, or they're the major funder, or you know, there's a lot. And some authorities are a bit more imaginative than others. But I think it's quite hard when you've got stuff, you know, when you've got buildings and you've got a 3-year plan with budgets in it, and you've got a cultural strategy, and you've got the crushing momentum of all those things is really overwhelming, and it's hard to reimagine them, you know. And it's partly a factor of scale. I mean, it's much easier for small organisations or individual artists to just change what they do sometimes, you know. They're much more deft, and that's why I think often a lot more dynamic things come from the smaller parts of the sector, you know. So if you know, and I don't know if any of you ever worked with Tate or V&A or any of those. I mean, they're extremely large machines, and it's very hard for them to make radical decisions, and you know, they're not nimble. It's like turning around an oil tanker, you know. And they do a certain thing, you know, they deliver the oil to where they want to go, and they go in a straight line, and lots of good things happen because of that. But I think, no, I haven't met many people in local authorities recently who are really seeing this as a radical opportunity for them. And I'm not surprised to hear you say that. But I mean, to be fair to a lot of colleagues who work in that sector, there's a lot of pressure on them from members and other people who don't understand the cultural context. You know, it's not. There are very few councillors who really understand how culture's made and disseminated. So the big, you know, having the big showpiece things, you know, having a gallery and a theatre in your town and stuff is you know, it's what they think that is, and it's hard to inject something else to them.
Thank you.
Laura.
I suppose that actually, this is an interesting conversation, because this is where my brain was starting to go. I was wondering, and this is asking this question as a safe question or as a provocation, not necessarily as anyone should be doing this, but has anyone been thinking about what happens if they don't try to keep their organisation going? I'm here with my Barbican hat on, but I have another limited company, and one of the questions I've given myself a lot of permission for is to go, well, what happens if this is the end of its lifeline, the entire company? What if I wrap the company up? What is both the permissions around that? What's the understanding that's not us having messed up, but what sometimes, like, what does the permission to change direction give? And I'm just wondering if anyone else has been having that conversation within their organisations. Because I think it's actually, if you're thinking about resilience, is a really healthy thing to do, to just go, what if we stopped? What if we genuinely stopped? I mean, the Barbican has charitable aims. There's lots more complications right now. But question?
Laura, I think that's an entirely healthy and sensible thing to do, that you should always be doing. Is this still needed? What if this was a response to something a few years ago? Is that response still needed, or has the world moved on? Is there a more appropriate way I could be responding to whatever the need has been evolved into? And how have the skills we have learnt along the way, how has that changed what my response would be if I was starting now? I think in our country in particular, the British view failure as very shameful and embarrassing, and other cultures are much more interested in the fact that you gave it a go, you learn something, you pick yourself up, and you kind of like wrap what you learned into something and move on to the next thing that really makes your blood fizz with excitement. It's okay to go, this is not making me happy anymore. It's not making the people it's supposed to serve happy anymore. I'm not going to do this. That's okay. It's not dirty. And actually, if you're feeling a bit awkward about it, now's a really good time to do it, because you don't have to explain it very hard. You just go, coronavirus, and everyone goes, oh yeah.
Hannah?
I think that with that as well, it's also questions around accepting funding and the responsibility of doing that right now. And I think that's something that we've certainly been thinking about a lot. You know, there's a lot of conversations around that at the moment in terms of the emergency funding available through Arts Council, and how that creates a really strange situation for the arts community. And so how, if you're going to take that money or any future money, you know, a level of responsibility, even more now than ever, becomes really at the forefront of that, and about how you can take that in a really responsible and generous way, and, you know, make it work really hard. And I think, you know, that's something that we're certainly thinking about, and thinking about whether or not to take money where it's been offered recently. So yeah.
Anna, if I could add another point that's related to that, that's a very good point. If you're holding restricted funds and you're using them to cash flow unrestricted activity, that's not a problem per se if you subsequently pay back the restricted funds and then carry it, you know. But the thing just to be really careful about, if you are, any of you, close to insolvency or winding up at any point, if you're caught at that point having used restricted funds for unrestricted activity, it's a double whammy. You've got a breach of trust, and the individual trustees can be asked to repay the restricted funds. So, I mean, I've used in my career, I've used restricted funds many times for cash flow, you know, to make payroll and things like that, but always with the understanding and expectation that you have a plan where the unrestricted funds come back and you pay them back. So everyone understand the point I'm making? So there's the Insolvency Act, which is suspended at the moment anyway in terms of insolvent trading. Everyone aware of that? So it's a rare, you know, it's and very sensible it is too that it's not there. But the charity, if those of you that are charities and have restricted funds, you have to be particularly careful. If I were a board member of a performing arts charity right now, I'd want to be all over that one.
Great. Any other thoughts or questions for Tom or for one another? If not, then maybe it's a good time to stop. And then offer you a huge amount of thanks, Tom, for your expertise and for joining us in Plymouth.
Lovely to be in Plymouth again. It's great. To see you all. I wish you luck with it. If there's anything I can help with, if Kim, Hannah, or Laura pass on my email. Also, my colleague Amy will send the slides and a few other things as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you to Hannah and Laura for working on this with me. And we'll be in touch really soon, I hope. And I hope to see you guys sometime soon.
Yeah.
Bye everyone. We'll be in touch quite soon.